Danielle Brooks just wanted a peaceful evening with her family. But from the moment she stepped into Brickell's Whole Foods, the air felt colder than the AC. The sky was melting into pink over Biscayne Bay, a soft Miami spring dusk. Danielle had left the courthouse earlier than usual, winning a hearing for a teenage client she'd grown fond of. She could have celebrated with colleagues. Instead, she chose something better: roasted salmon, roasted sweet potatoes, asparagus, and her son's favorite sparkling apple cider. Dressed in a plain white t-shirt, faded jeans, and her worn navy Converse, Danielle parked her aging hatchback between two polished Teslas. She stepped out, her long black curls pulled into a low-puff tote bag slung over her shoulder. As a black woman, especially one who had achieved success in a world not built for her, Danielle was used to walking into upscale spaces with a quiet steel in her spine. Whole Foods in Brickell was practically a cathedral of curated wealth: gleaming tiles, artful displays of organic produce, imported French cheeses, and a wine section guarded like a museum. Danielle pushed her cart through the entrance, nodding politely to the greeter, who barely looked up. The produce section smelled of citrus and rain-washed greens. She ran her fingers over a bundle of asparagus, inspecting it like a jeweler with fine stones. Her list was simple, but every item felt intentional: salmon, asparagus, sweet potatoes, sparkling cider. As she placed the asparagus into her cart, her ears caught the whisper, "No way she's buying anything real." The voice was quiet but pointed, coming from a woman in athleisure wear near the berries. Her friend stifled a giggle. Danielle didn't react. She never gave them the satisfaction. Instead, she gently reached for a lemon, rolling it in her hand before placing it in her cart. She made her way to the seafood counter. "Hi there, center-cut salmon fillet, please," she said with a smile. The young man behind the counter avoided eye contact, but wrapped the fish quickly and passed it over. Danielle thanked him and moved on. Passing through the aisles, she caught snippets of glances. A man in a golf shirt looked her up and down, his eyes resting on her scuffed sneakers, then muttered something about standards under his breath. Danielle let out a quiet exhale. It wasn't new. She was a successful civil rights attorney, graduate of Howard Law, a wife and mother, but her skin and her clothes still made her suspect in places like this. That reality was a steady companion, familiar as her shadow. In the beverage aisle, she selected a bottle of sparkling cider. The green glass was cold against her palm, and she imagined the joy on Miles's face when he saw it. The thought warmed her more than the Miami air. As she headed to the checkout, the quiet hum of a walkie-talkie reached her ears. She didn't need to look. She could feel the weight of his stare. At the register, the cashier, a pale-skinned woman with a tight bun and the name Samantha on her tag, greeted Danielle with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She scanned each item with mechanical precision, only pausing when her eyes flicked to Danielle's tote bag. Danielle noticed. The salmon, the lemon, the cider, all scanned, no small talk. Danielle handed over her payment card. When the transaction was complete, Samantha reached briefly below the counter. Danielle didn't move. Her tote was on the counter. She calmly began repacking the items. As she approached the exit, the automatic doors slid open. Beep. A single piercing beep echoed from the security sensors. Danielle turned slowly. Rick Nolan, the security guard she had seen earlier, was already walking toward her. A security guard stepped into the aisle. His radio crackles. Danielle straightens up. It wasn't just suspicion, it was surveillance. Danielle Brooks, a poised and accomplished black woman, could feel the eyes on her before she even reached the seafood counter. Her skin, deep and warm like polished mahogany, had always seemed to speak louder than her Harvard law degree or courtroom victories. But here, under the sterile white lights of Brickell's Whole Foods, it was her skin and her simple clothes that defined how people read her. Earlier whispers still echoed faintly in her mind, but Danielle stayed focused. She adjusted the strap of her tote and gently placed the salmon on top of the asparagus. This wasn't new. A Damo woman walking alone in a luxury grocery store carrying herself with quiet assurance always seemed to draw more attention than a shopper in Lululemon or heels. The air carried the faint scent of lemon and lavender soap, but beneath it lay something more acidic judgment. She turned the corner near the bakery and immediately spotted him. Officer Rick Nolan stood by the wine display pretending to study labels. He was tall, broad-chested, wearing the gray uniform of mall security. His skin was pale, his jaw square, his eyes cold. Though he pretended to glance casually, Danielle recognized the stance. His posture screamed alert. His hand hovered near the radio clipped to his chest. She'd seen this kind of watchfulness before in courtrooms, lobbies, airports. It didn't matter that she was the one more likely to defend than disturb. Rick's voice crackled low into the radio. "Still on her. Doesn't fit the profile," he muttered. Danielle paused by the refrigerated juices, her jaw tightening. Profile. She looked down at her cart groceries for a family dinner, nothing more. Yet somehow her presence in this space, in this body, wearing that shirt and those sneakers, had become a silent offense. Nearby, two young women in matching workout sets lingered by the organic soda. One glanced at Danielle, then leaned toward her friend. "She's probably just browsing," the girl whispered with a smirk. "No way she can afford this place." They both laughed softly, not maliciously, but carelessly, as if she were invisible or worse, unworthy of being noticed at all. Danielle said nothing. She picked up a bottle of Miles's favorite cider and cradled it carefully in her arm before placing it into the cart. The glass touched the canvas of her tote with a gentle thud. Her grip tightened on the cart's handle, but her back stayed straight. She was used to this, the performance of dignity in the face of disbelief. She moved slowly down the aisle past gleaming shelves of imported vinegar and stacked rows of artisan crackers. Her ears picked up the rhythm of Rick's boots behind her. Click, click, pause, click again. A predator pretending to stroll. Danielle reached the self-checkout lane only to find it temporarily closed. A handwritten sign taped lazily across the touchscreen blinked in apology. She turned toward the regular checkout lanes. 3 were open. She chose the one with the shortest line behind a man with a cart full of protein bars and pre-packaged greens. Rick shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a few feet away, arms crossed tightly over his chest. She didn't have to look at him. She could feel the heat of his gaze. Samantha, the same cashier from earlier, was now scanning the protein bars. She offered a bright smile to the man ahead, her nails tapping rhythmically on the counter. When Danielle stepped forward, the smile faded. Samantha greeted her with the same kind of politeness reserved for rules, not people. Danielle noticed the way her eyes flitted toward the tote again, toward the bag of salmon nestled near the lemon. No warmth. No welcome. She scanned the asparagus, then the lemon. When she reached the salmon, she paused just a second longer than necessary. Danielle's eyes didn't waver. Her fingers remained gently curled around the cart handle. Samantha scanned the cider last, then slid her hand under the register, fumbling with something Danielle couldn't see. No explanation. No words. Danielle paid. Samantha handed her the receipt without looking up. She placed her items into the tote bag, mindful calm. She walked toward the exit, every step measured her cart rolling in sync with the hum of jazz playing overhead. She was 3 feet from the automatic doors when the sensor beeped sharp, accusing final. Danielle turned. Rick was already striding toward her, his lips tight, his walk deliberate. A security guard stepped into the aisle. His radio crackles. Danielle straightens up. Danielle didn't speak, but her eyes did. They burned with the pain of every time she'd been judged without cause. As Officer Rick Nolan gripped her arm just firmly enough to draw eyes without quite crossing a legal line, she inhaled slowly, anchoring herself in the deep well of restraint she'd built over decades as a black woman navigating spaces that weren't designed for her. "Ma'am," Rick said, voice clipped. "I need you to come with me." Shoppers paused. Some slowed their carts. Others openly turned to look. Danielle noticed the familiar choreography, the subtle shuffling, the quick glances, the raised eyebrows. A few began whispering to companions. She didn't resist. She simply nodded and walked tote in hand beside Rick as he led her toward the store's customer service office. The polished floor reflected the glint of overhead lights and the growing suspicion around her. Inside the small glass-walled room tucked near the exit, the store's manager, a wiry man in a too-tight polo, waited with a tight smile and nervous fingers. "We had an alert at the exit gate," he said, his voice wobbly. "It's standard protocol to check." Danielle set her tote on the table. "Please," she said evenly, "check whatever you like." Rick unzipped the tote and began removing items one by one: lemon asparagus, cider, salmon. And then, a small jar of caviar nestled against the cider. Danielle stared at it. She hadn't touched any caviar, not even walked by that section. "This wasn't scanned," Rick said, turning the jar in his gloved hand. The manager frowned. Samantha, the cashier, was suddenly in the doorway, biting her lip. "I didn't see her put it in," Samantha offered faintly. "But it's there." Danielle met Samantha's eyes. There was something in them, guilt maybe, or fear of being caught. But no honesty. "I'd like to see the footage," Danielle said, her voice low but clear. The manager hesitated. "We can have security review it." "No," another voice interrupted. "You can do it now." Everyone turned. A tall man in a navy blazer stood just outside the glass wall. His stride was calm but purposeful as he stepped into the room, dark brown eyes scanning the scene. His voice was unmistakable, resonant, measured, but carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised. "What exactly are you accusing my wife of?" Christopher Brooks, CEO of Brooks Global Holdings, was not the kind of man people interrupted. The manager's face drained of color. Rick's jaw twitched. Samantha blinked twice, frozen. Danielle didn't move, but in the stillness, something within her softened only slightly. Christopher looked at Rick first. "You grabbed her. In public." Based on what Rick gestured helplessly to the tote. "The system went off. We found the jar." "She didn't put that jar in her bag," Christopher said, already pulling out his phone. "And we're going to watch the footage to confirm that." Within minutes, the security supervisor arrived, a stocky man in khakis, who instantly recognized Christopher. He nodded frantically, muttering, "Yes, of course, Mr. Brooks," before tapping into the computer terminal. On the monitor, the checkout lane flickered into view, Danielle placing her items. Samantha scanning them until just as Danielle reached for her wallet, Samantha leaned subtly under the counter, her hand dipping quickly and returning to Danielle's tote with something clenched between her fingers. The footage stopped. Silence swelled in the room. Gasps sounded faintly from outside the glass wall, shoppers now pressing in to watch. Danielle stood still, her gaze steady. Her voice, when it came, was like quiet thunder. "You framed me." Samantha opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Christopher turned to Rick. "And you judged her. No cause, no facts, just her skin, Her clothes? Rick looked away. The store manager stepped back, eyes wide, mouthing something like, "We'll fix this." Christopher turned to the crowd, now spilling into the hallway. For those of you wondering, yes, this is my wife, Danielle Brooks. The same Danielle who made a Fortune 500 CEO confess under oath, who left a six-figure job offer to build a legal clinic in Overtown. She came here to buy dinner for our son. And this, he gestured to the caviar jar, is what prejudice looks like when it hides behind customer service. The quiet in the store was total. The women from the sparkling water aisle stood pale-faced, one clutching her purse like a lifeline. The man in the golf shirt from earlier stared at his shoes. Danielle didn't smile. She didn't need to. Christopher looked at the manager. They're terminated. Now. The manager nodded silently. Rick muttered something of faint apology, but Danielle raised a hand. Your apology doesn't undo the humiliation. You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. Her words landed like stones. The weight of them hung in the room more powerful than shouting ever could be. She turned toward Christopher, his hand reaching for hers. Let's go home, he said softly. Danielle nodded. Her tote bag now repacked the same groceries inside, except this time they carried a different kind of weight. She stepped into the hallway. The crowd parted. Christopher turned to Rick and Samantha. You're both done here. The store manager hurries forward, pale-faced. The truth had landed like thunder, but silence was louder. Danielle Brooks stood at the edge of the customer service office, her hand still in Christopher's, as dozens of eyes watched them from the glossy aisles of Whole Foods Brickell. The polished marble beneath her feet gleamed as if nothing had happened, as if the store could simply absorb the stain of prejudice and go on selling truffle oil and imported fruit like nothing had cracked the glass. But something had, and everyone knew it. The salmon still rested in her tote bag, the cider clinking softly against it with each slow breath she took. Samantha Green, the cashier who had quietly slipped the jar of caviar into Danielle's bag, now stood with her arms crossed, tightly shrinking behind the service desk, like a child awaiting punishment. Her eyeliner smudged slightly at the corner. Her lips were pressed into a thin, colorless line. Officer Rick Nolan, who had gripped Danielle's arm minutes earlier without a word of apology, now stood stiff and awkward by the corner of the room, trying not to make eye contact with anyone. His security badge looked suddenly heavy on his chest, and the radio at his hip, which had buzzed with such confidence earlier, was now silent. The store manager, still red-faced, cleared his throat. "Mr. Brooks," he began, "we take this very seriously. We'll file an incident report, of course, and we'll terminate." Christopher didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Don't file. Act." The man nodded quickly, pulling out a corporate-issued iPad from the drawer behind him. He began typing furiously, muttering something about protocol and immediate HR flags. But Danielle's eyes weren't on him. They were on the crowd. A few shoppers had remained behind, pretending to browse the olive oil or protein bars while subtly watching the scene unfold. One of the women who had whispered earlier stood frozen by the fruit display, her toddler tugging at her wrist. A man in slacks and a monogrammed polo had stopped pretending to check the kombucha flavors. He was now openly listening. Danielle stepped forward, placing the tote bag fully on the counter, her posture calm but unshakable. Her voice when she spoke was soft, but it carried. "You didn't just accuse me of stealing," she said, looking not at Samantha or Rick, but at the space between them, the system that allowed this moment to happen. "You accused me of not belonging here. You saw a black woman with a canvas tote bag and decided I was here to take, not to buy, not to feed my family, not to enjoy my Friday evening. You didn't ask. You assumed. That's not a mistake. That's a mindset. Samantha looked like she might cry, but Danielle didn't turn to her. This moment wasn't about the tears of the guilty. It was about naming the harm. Christopher stood beside her, silent but grounded. His presence said everything he didn't need to. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. The store manager cleared his throat again. They'll both be let go by end of day, he said, trying to salvage control. Christopher nodded, but his gaze never left his wife. Danielle glanced back at the crowd. She noticed a young woman, maybe in her 20s, standing near the floral section. She wore a navy hoodie and glasses, her mixed-race features framed by soft curls. Their eyes met for a moment. The young woman gave a small nod, subtle but unmistakably one of solidarity. Danielle lowered her gaze just slightly before turning back toward the aisle. The salmon, the cider, the asparagus, they were still hers. But now they felt heavier, as though each item carried the invisible weight of what had just transpired. They stepped into the aisle together. The whispers returned softer this time. Not gossip, reflection, awareness. At the door, Rick moved aside without a word. Danielle passed him with her head held high. They walked through the exit slowly, the store's sliding doors parting not with welcome but with resignation. Outside, the humid Miami evening had softened into a dusky lavender. The streetlights cast a faint orange glow across the sidewalk. Christopher helped her load the groceries into the hatchback. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Inside the car, Danielle sat for a beat before starting the engine. I don't want that to be the story Miles hears one day, she said quietly. Christopher turned to her, his eyes warm. Then let's write the real one. Together. She nodded. As they pulled away from the curb, the store faded behind them, its glass and steel cold under the dimming sky. But Danielle didn't look back. Not once. Outside the store, Danielle glances at the bag of groceries still in her cart. Let's go home, she says. Her voice doesn't shake. The kitchen glowed golden. The salmon sizzled. And for the first time all day, Danielle Brooks let herself exhale. The familiar hiss of oil meeting skin on fish filled the air, mingling with the earthy scent of sweet potatoes roasting and the crisp brightness of sliced lemon. Outside, the Miami sky darkened into a velvet purple, and the lights from downtown glittered like scattered confetti beyond the wide windows of their Edgewater home. Danielle moved with the easy rhythm of someone returning to herself. Her white t-shirt had been swapped for a loose cotton tank, her curls tucked into a soft wrap. But her skin, radiant and deep brown, still carried the heat of the day's indignity. And yet here in this space, she'd helped build with love and years of resilience, she didn't feel judged. She felt rooted. Miles, their 6-year-old son, perched on a counter stool, kicking his socked feet and rambling about his school day with the exuberance only a child untouched by the world's sharp edges could maintain. And then, Mommy, I did my superhero drawing, but this time with a cape and a shield, he said, eyes bright. And Miss Carter said I used real textures, I used cotton balls and glitter and glue, but not too much, because last time it dripped on Lucy's hair. Danielle laughed softly, wiping her hands on a towel. That sounds like a masterpiece in motion, she said, planting a kiss on the crown of his head. Miles grinned and reached for the sparkling cider Christopher had just poured into a glass, shaped like a miniature champagne flute. Christopher, now out of his blazer and in a faded black tee, looked across the kitchen island at his wife. His dark eyes held that familiar blend of pride and concern, of love shaped by shared battles. He raised his glass. To the chef, he said. Miles lifted his own glass high. To Mommy, the best chef ever. Danielle laughed again, fuller this time, letting it ring out. The market's ordeal, the suspicion, the accusation, the humiliation. It was still there, but it had lost its power to tighten her chest. In the warmth of this kitchen, It became something else, not a wound, but a scar. Something she would carry, but that no longer defined the moment. Dinner was served on mismatched ceramic plates. The salmon flaked perfectly. The asparagus snapped with a tender crunch. Sweet potatoes dusted with cinnamon and sea salt melted in the mouth. They ate slowly, without screens or background noise, just the occasional clink of silverware and Miles's unstoppable chatter. After a while, he asked, "Did anything interesting happen to you today?" Mommy Danielle paused. She glanced at Christopher. He gave a subtle nod. "Well," she began gently, "I did have an interesting visit to the grocery store." She kept her tone light as she described how someone had assumed she didn't belong there, how they thought she might have taken something she didn't pay for. Miles tilted his head. Why Danielle smoothed the napkin in her lap. Sometimes people see someone who looks different, someone with brown skin or who dresses simply, and they decide who that person is before they even know them. They judge. Miles frowned, stirring his mashed sweet potatoes. "That's not fair." "No," Danielle said softly. "It's not." Christopher added, "But your mommy stood tall. She reminded them that character matters more than clothes or assumptions." Danielle met her son's eyes. "And we reminded them who we are." There was a pause. Then Miles smiled again. "So you were kind of a superhero too?" Danielle laughed again, tears almost rising behind it. "Maybe a little." After dinner, Christopher cleared the plates while Danielle stepped onto the balcony. The river shimmered under the city lights, soft waves lapping the seawall below. The air smelled faintly of jasmine from the neighbor's trellis, and in the distance a boat passed slowly, its lights blinking red and gold across the water. She leaned on the railing, arms folded, letting the night breathe around her. The injustice of the day didn't vanish, but it shifted. It no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a spark. Christopher joined her a moment later, wrapping an arm gently around her waist. "I was proud of you," he said. Danielle nodded slowly. "It wasn't just about me," she whispered. "It's never just about me." Christopher waited. She turned to him fully. "I keep thinking about the other people, those without you standing beside them, without a title or a camera to prove their truth. I don't want to just walk away from this. I want to use it." He smiled knowingly. "The foundation." Danielle nodded. "We've talked about expanding the Brooks Hope Initiative for years. Legal literacy, public rights, anti-bias training in public spaces. Maybe this is the push I needed." He kissed her temple. "Then let's start." Behind them, Miles shouted from inside Mommy, "Tell me a story." Danielle turned her face, glowing in the balcony light. "Coming, baby." She gave one last glance to the river. Its surface mirrored the stars, fractured, beautiful, constantly in motion. She was ready. From inside, Miles calls Mommy, "Tell me a story." Danielle turns, smiling. She's ready. The Monday after the incident at Whole Foods dawned quiet and bright, as if the world itself was trying to press a soft cloth over the bruises of the week before. The streets of Miami bustled as usual, coffee carts, steaming dogs tugging impatiently at their leashes, and downtown buildings throwing sharp sunlight across busy sidewalks. But in a modest community center nestled in the heart of Overtown, something quietly remarkable was unfolding. Danielle Brooks stood near a folding table lined with clipboards and sign-in sheets. She wore a sleeveless navy dress, her natural curls pulled back a pair of simple flats, grounding her like always. Beside her, a banner flapped lightly in the breeze. The Brooks Hope Initiative. Know your rights. Know your power. A few folding chairs were already occupied. Mothers with strollers, young workers in scrubs, an elderly man with a cane and sharp eyes. Danielle, a woman de Mao with poise etched into every gesture, greeted each person warmly. Thank you for coming. Please grab a brochure and make yourself comfortable. We'll begin in just a few. This wasn't a courtroom or a press conference. There were no marble columns or reporters scribbling headlines. But Danielle felt something settle in her bones. This, she knew, was where justice truly began. One person, one story, one tool of empowerment at a time. She didn't do it alone. Christopher stood just behind her, helping direct guests towards seating and refreshments. Their son Miles sat at the corner of the room, drawing superheroes with capes and lawyer briefcases, his own way of narrating what he saw. The first workshop of the day was a legal literacy session, understanding your rights when stopped in public places, how to request footage, how to file a formal complaint. Danielle led the talk with clarity and calm, weaving real-life examples into each point. She didn't mention Whole Foods by name, but everyone there had heard. It had spread through word of mouth through a quiet ripple that said, "She didn't stay silent." During the break, a middle-aged woman approached her, clutching her purse tightly. Her eyes were rimmed with weariness, her voice tentative. I've never talked about it," the woman said. "But something like that happened to me, years ago, at a department store in Coral Gables. I still remember the way they looked at me, like I couldn't possibly afford a $40 sweater." Danielle reached for her hand gently. "You don't owe them silence," she said. "Your story matters. You matter." The woman nodded, blinking quickly. By noon, the second session had begun training for business owners and public staff on unconscious bias and respectful interaction. Christopher took the lead here, speaking not as a CEO, but as a husband, a father, a black man who'd witnessed his wife shrink beneath judgment, not born of truth, but assumption. "We're not here to accuse," he said plainly. "We're here to prevent." One of the attendees, a young barista from a cafe chain, raised his hand. "How do we know when it's bias or just protocol?" Danielle stepped in, her voice firm but kind. "Protocol doesn't ask you to forget someone's humanity. It should never start with suspicion. It should start with dignity." Later that afternoon, a woman in corporate attire quietly approached. She introduced herself as a regional manager from another Whole Foods location. "I just wanted to say," she began, "what happened last week wasn't just about one store. It's a mirror. We're watching. And some of us, we're changing things. Internally." Danielle simply nodded. "Then start where it counts, with who you hire, how you train, and how you listen." As the last chairs were stacked and the final thank yous exchanged, Miles tugged at his mother's hand. "Did we do something big today?" he asked. Danielle smiled down at him, eyes soft but steady. "We did something small," she said. "But small things can grow." That night, the three of them sat on the floor of their living room, a soft jazz record playing in the background. Miles was curled under a blanket with a book. Christopher leaned against the couch, his arm brushing Danielle's knee. She stared out the window, the reflection of the city flickering in her glass of tea. She didn't want revenge. She didn't even want vindication. She wanted movement. She wanted the quiet ripple of change, the kind that began not with headlines, but with eye contact, with truth, with staying in the room after the apology and asking, "Now what?" And most of all, she wanted Miles to grow up in a world where he didn't have to be twice as careful just to be seen as worthy. As the record turned, Danielle reached for her laptop. Her inbox pinged with 2 new messages, one from a local news station, asking for a segment on everyday discrimination, the other from a mother in Tampa seeking legal support for her teenage son. She replied to both. Christopher looked over. "Work already," Danielle closed the lid. "No. Just beginnings." Outside, Miami breathed in its usual humidity and neon. Inside, the Brooks family carved out something rare and precious: space. Space for justice. Space for healing. Space to begin again. The next morning, a woman Danielle had never met walked into a grocery store, stood a little taller, and asked to speak to the manager, not to complain, but to teach. And that was where change began again. Some evenings, when the city has quieted and the windows flicker with warm light, Danielle Brooks stands at her kitchen sink and watches the reflection of her son drawing at the table behind her. She doesn't always think of that Friday in the grocery store, but when she does, it's no longer with heat in her chest. It's with the quiet clarity that comes when truth has been spoken and heard. That day wasn't just about a misunderstanding or a misjudged glance. It was about something deeper. About the weight so many carry just by entering a space that wasn't designed for them. And about what it means to stand calmly, firmly in the face of that weight and say, "I belong here." Danielle didn't yell. She didn't demand revenge. She simply held her ground, named the injustice, and chose a different kind of power, the power to educate, to build, to reach back and pull others forward. With her husband beside her and her son watching, she turned that moment of pain into a platform for change. Not for applause, but for community, for dignity. And isn't that what resilience truly is? Not just surviving what was meant to break you, but planting something stronger in its place. The lesson of Danielle's story isn't flashy or loud. It's the quiet kind, the kind that sinks in slowly, the way sunlight seeps through curtains on a soft morning. It reminds us that justice doesn't always come with gavels or headlines. Sometimes it looks like a canvas tote bag, a soft no, a child's drawing of a superhero who doesn't need a mask. Prejudice often hides in plain sight in how we greet a stranger, in who we assume is telling the truth, in what we expect someone to be based on their clothes, their accent, their skin. But it's through talent, integrity, and courage that those walls are dismantled, not all at once, but one interaction, one truth-telling, one act of dignity at a time. And perhaps in your own life you've witnessed it too. A neighbor who's overlooked until they're needed. A friend misjudged until they speak. Or maybe it's your own story, the one you've carried quietly. Know this: your truth matters, and it deserves space. Like a porch light left on for someone returning late, Danielle's story is a reminder that we each have the power to light the way for ourselves and for others. Not with grand gestures, but with steady action and open hearts. So tonight, if this story lingers with you, if it hums in your chest like an old tune, consider sharing it. Not for clicks or comments, but to remind someone else that they too deserve to be seen clearly. Not through the lens of fear, but through the lens of truth. Because maybe, just maybe, kindness is the most radical form of justice, and the quiet strength to stand in your truth is where real change begins.